Yucatan lowlands, the dry season. Somewhere in the vicinity of 800 AD, the city should be sleeping. At this hour, in any other season, the only sounds would be the chirp of insects in the scrub beyond the city walls, the distant call of a nightbird moving through the canopy, the slow breathing of 50,000 people horizontal in the dark. The plazas would be empty, the temple steps pale in moonlight, the whole enormous apparatus of civilization folded quietly into itself until dawn. But tonight the city is not quiet. Tonight something is wrong. The man who notices first is a waterkeeper, one of the low-ranking officials whose entire purpose is to monitor the reservoir levels through the dry months, to track the slow descent of the waterline against the plastered walls, to ensure that what was collected during the rainy season will last until the rains return. He walks the same path he has walked 1,000 times, carrying the same clay lamp, performing the same ritual check. And then he stops. The water has changed color. Not dramatically, not the sudden catastrophic transformation that demands immediate action. Something subtler, and in some ways more disturbing. A shift toward rust, toward the greenish brown of something living and wrong. A change that whispers rather than shouts, that asks a question he does not have a framework to answer. He crouches at the reservoir's edge. The smell reaches him. Something organic, something that should not be here. He does not know what he is looking at. He has no word for cyanobacteria, no concept of mercury accumulation, no understanding of what happens when a civilization spends centuries washing its sacred red pigments into the water it drinks. He knows only that the reservoir smells different, looks different, feels different, in a way that settles cold and quiet in his chest, as he stands and looks out over the city that depends on this water to survive. He will report it in the morning. He will tell the priests. They will perform the appropriate ceremonies. They will ask Chak, the rain deity, for intervention. They will do everything their civilization has taught them to do when the world stops behaving correctly. It will not be enough. Between 800 and 900 AD, across a crescent of lowland cities that had stood for centuries, something went catastrophically wrong. Tikal, one of the greatest cities the Western Hemisphere had ever produced. Karakol, whose kings had defeated the mightiest rivals of the classic period. Calakmul, the Snake Kingdom, whose political reach had extended across hundreds of miles of jungle. Copan, where the most extraordinary record of royal history in the Maya world had been carved in stone, meant to last forever. One by one across a span of decades, these cities emptied. The monuments stopped being built. The reservoirs fell silent. The populations that had sustained complex, sophisticated, literate civilization for 600 years dispersed into the jungle and did not return. Historians called it the Maya collapse. But collapse implies something that came from outside, a force that struck, a blow that felled. What the evidence preserved in the sediment of Maya reservoirs increasingly suggests is something far more unsettling than invasion, or earthquake, or simple drought. The water those cities depended on had turned against them. The reservoirs, those extraordinary feats of engineering that had made civilization in a waterless landscape possible, had become lethally toxic. Mercury concentrations many times above any survivable threshold. Cyanobacterial blooms producing toxins that destroyed liver tissue. Pathogenic contamination at levels that would sicken and kill across every demographic. The Maya did not simply run out of water. They poisoned the water they had. And the poison was not an accident of nature or the work of an enemy. It was the byproduct of everything that made their civilization extraordinary. Its scale, its rituals, its beauty, its ambition. Tonight, we are going to descend into that story. We will begin with the cities themselves, with the almost incomprehensible engineering achievement of building a hydraulic civilization in terrain that had no business supporting one. We will then examine what the science preserved in the sediment actually shows, the chemistry of a slow catastrophe building across generations. We will follow the drought that broke the system beyond its capacity to recover, and we will explore what Maya people experienced and understood as their world changed around them. And finally, we will sit with what this story means, not as cautionary tale or historical curiosity, but as a record of what human ambition can build and what it can, without ever intending to, destroy. The waterkeeper who crouched at the reservoir's edge that night was watching the end of something that had taken centuries to build and would take another century to fully fall. He did not know that. He could not have known that. By the time this story's done, you will. So settle in. Let the darkness of the Yucatan night hold you, and let us go back to the beginning, to the moment when someone looked at a landscape with no water and decided to build a civilization there anyway. Begin with a simple fact that becomes more astonishing the longer you sit with it. The Maya lowlands have no rivers, not in the sense that matters for a civilization, no permanent, navigable, year-round surface water, flowing reliably enough to anchor a city, to water fields through a dry season, to give 50,000 people something to drink when the sky stops giving. The great river civilizations of the ancient world, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, all built their urban cores along water that was simply there, that arrived from mountains or distant rainfall and moved through the landscape as a permanent gift, renewing itself daily, requiring no human engineering to exist, asking only that cities position themselves along its banks and draw from its abundance. The Maya lowlands offered nothing of the kind. What they offered instead was limestone. The entire Yucatan Peninsula sits atop a vast platform of cast limestone, porous and fractured, riddled with underground channels and caverns that swallow surface water almost as fast as it falls. When rain comes to the lowlands, and in the wet season, between May and October, it comes in quantities that would seem generous to any farmer accustomed to temperate climates. It doesn't pool. It does not run in streams or collect in natural lakes. It sinks. It disappears into the rock within hours, draining down through fractures and fissures into aquifers that sit far below any practical means of access, without the infrastructure that would not exist for another 1,000 years. For 5 months of the year, the lowlands receive abundant rainfall. For the other 7 months, they receive almost nothing. And between those two seasonal extremes, the surface of the land holds almost no water at all. No ponds, no springs worth speaking of, no slow-moving rivers cutting through the jungle floor, just limestone and heat, and a dry season that stretches from November to April with a patience that feels, to anyone living through it without stored water, like the patience of something that means to outlast you. This is the landscape in which the Maya decided to build the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere. By the time the Classic period reached its height, between approximately 200 and 900 AD, the Maya lowland supported an urban population that modern demographic estimates place somewhere between 7 and 11 million people. These were not scattered village communities or seasonal encampments or the thin, mobile populations that many ancient societies maintained in marginal landscapes. These were cities in every meaningful sense, densely populated, architecturally monumental, politically sophisticated, economically complex, literate in a writing system capable of recording history, astronomy, mathematics, and theology with precision that still commands the respect of modern scholars. Tikal, in what is now northern Guatemala, covered roughly 50 square miles of urban space and supported a population that estimates range between 60,000 and 100,000 people at its peak. Caracol, in Belize, may have housed over 100,000. Calakmul, in the southern Yucatan, it commanded a political network that dominated the entire region for generations. Its emblem glyph, appearing in tribute records and subordinate monuments across hundreds of miles of lowland jungle. Copan, in what is now the western Honduras, produced the most detailed dynastic record in the Maya world, a sequence of 16 rulers carved into stone monuments and architectural facades with an obsessive historical precision that suggests a civilization deeply aware of its own significance. None of these cities should have been possible. Every principle of ancient urban geography, every lesson drawn from the comparative study of early civilizations across the globe, suggests that urbanism at this scale requires reliable water, and reliable water requires rivers, lakes, or aquifers, shallow enough to access without industrial technology. The Maya lowlands had none of these things in the quantities required. What they had instead was ingenuity of a kind that deserves to be understood as one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, ranking alongside the aqueducts of Rome and the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, though it receives a fraction of the scholarly attention and almost none of the popular recognition that those better-known achievements command. The Maya built their water, not metaphorically, literally. They engineered a system for capturing, storing, and distributing rainfall that transformed an inhospitable limestone plateau into the foundation of a hydraulic civilization capable of supporting millions of people across 6 centuries of continuous occupation. The core of this system was the reservoir, called in the archaeological literature an aguada, a large plastered basin excavated into the bedrock and sealed with a coating of lime plaster that prevented the water from sinking away into the porous limestone below. These reservoirs ranged in size from modest neighborhood cisterns that served a few hundred households to vast civic water stores that could hold tens of millions of gallons and served as the hydraulic heart of an entire urban region. Ticol's central reservoir complex consisted of at least 10 major storage basins, interconnected by channels and sluice works, with a combined capacity that researchers estimate at somewhere between 90 and 100 million gallons. In a landscape with no rivers, this was the river. It was built by human hands, maintained by human labor, defended as the political and economic center of power that it actually was, and it made possible everything that grew up around it. The temples, the palaces, the marketplaces, the ball courts, the astronomical observatories, the entire elaborate apparatus of classic Maya civilization, resting ultimately on the question of whether enough rain would fall each year to fill those plastered basins before the dry season began to empty them. But the reservoirs were only one element of a system far more integrated and sophisticated than isolated storage basins would suggest. The entire urban landscape of a classic Maya city was engineered as a water harvesting machine. Every architectural element, every public space, in every paved surface participated in the hydraulic system in ways that modern visitors walking among Maya ruins rarely appreciate, because the system's elegance is invisible once the plaster has eroded and the channels have filled with vegetation and the functional logic of the layout has been obscured by time. The great plazas that define Maya civic space, those broad level plastered surfaces that surround the temple pyramids and administrative buildings at the heart of every major city, were not simply ceremonial spaces or public gathering grounds, though they were certainly both of those things. They were also vast catchment surfaces, angled with subtle but deliberate precision to direct every drop of rainfall toward channels that led to the reservoir network. The slope was almost imperceptible to a casual observer, a fraction of a degree in some cases, but it was not accidental. It was engineered. A single large plaza at a city like Tikal could capture millions of gallons during a single substantial rainstorm, funneling it through a network of drains and channels into the central storage system before it had any chance to sink into the limestone below or evaporate in the tropical heat. The plaza was not adjacent, to the water system. The plaza was part of the water system, inseparable from it, designed from its initial construction with hydraulic function, built into every calculated angle of its surface. The causeways, those elevated stone roads, called Sac Biob in Yucatec Maya, meaning white roads, that connected different sectors of cities and extended outward to link urban centers across the landscape, served a hydraulic function alongside their transportation and ceremonial purposes. Elevated above the surrounding terrain, they acted as barriers that slowed and redirected water flow during rainfall events, preventing runoff from escaping the catchment area and ensuring that precipitation falling on city infrastructure stayed within the urban water system rather than draining away into the surrounding jungle. Their whitewash lime surfaces, gleaming in the tropical sun, were also water collection surfaces, adding their runoff to the system during every rain event, functioning simultaneously as roads, as sacred processional ways, and as components of the water infrastructure that kept the city alive. Even individual buildings contributed to the system. Rooftop surfaces gathering rain that ran down through interior channels into household or neighborhood cisterns. Courtyard drains feeding into subsurface channels that connected to larger distribution networks. The architecture and the hydrology were one integrated system, and understanding one without the other means understanding neither. A well-designed Maya city wasted almost no rainfall. Every surface was a potential collector, every architectural element a potential component of the hydraulic infrastructure, every building an active participant in the annual cycle of capture, storage, and distribution that made urban life in a waterless landscape possible. The lime plaster that made the system function, the sealant that transformed porous limestone basins into watertight reservoirs and turned plaza pavements into efficient catchment surfaces, required enormous quantities of burned limestone to produce. Processing limestone into plaster requires sustained high-temperature burning, which in a pre-industrial context meant wood fuel, and enormous quantities of it. Researchers studying the energetics of Maya construction have calculated that producing sufficient plaster to build and maintain a single major reservoir required burning through substantial tracts of surrounding forest, and that maintaining Tikal's full reservoir system in good working order across its centuries of occupation represented a demand for wood fuel that scaled relentlessly with the city's population growth. The trees that kept the water in the reservoirs were the same trees whose removal from the surrounding hillsides would eventually contribute to increased soil erosion, increased sediment loading, and increased nutrient runoff into the reservoirs themselves. The mechanism of survival and the mechanism of long-term degradation were the same mechanism, operating simultaneously, their consequences separated by enough time that no single generation ever had to confront the full equation. That reckoning was centuries away from the engineers who first laid plaster over bedrock and watched the basin fill with captured rain. But it was coming. What the Maya created was not just an engineering solution to a geographical problem. It was a new relationship between civilization and landscape, one in which the city itself became the water source, in which the built environment actively participated in the hydrological cycle rather than simply sitting alongside a natural water body and drawing from its passive abundance. This was a fundamentally different approach to urban water management than anything produced by the river civilizations of the Old World, and it worked. It worked well enough to sustain cities of 100,000 people in a landscape that could not naturally support a fraction of that population. It worked for 6 centuries. That is not a failure. That is one of the most remarkable success stories in the entire history of human settlement, right up until the moment it became something else entirely. But the relationship between Maya civilization and water ran deeper than engineering, far deeper. In the cosmological framework that governed every aspect of classic Maya life, water was not infrastructure. Water was sacred substance, the medium through which the supernatural and natural worlds communicated, the element associated with the primordial creation, with the underworld, with the forces of renewal and destruction that cycled through Maya theological time in patterns that the astronomers and scribes tracked with extraordinary precision. Chak, the rain deity, was one of the most consistently present figures across the entire span of Maya religious art and architecture. His long-nosed, serpentine face appearing on temple facades, on ceramic vessels, on the facades of palaces, and on monuments erected by kings who understood that their legitimacy rested in part on their perceived relationship with the being who controlled rainfall. To rule a Maya city was, among other things, to be the human intermediary between the population and the cosmic forces that determined whether the rains would come and whether the reservoirs would fill. A king who could demonstrate, through ritual performance, through royal bloodletting, through monumental construction, dedicated to the appropriate deities, that he maintained the relationships necessary to bring rain, was a king whose city would grow and whose people would follow. A king whose reigns failed consecutively was a king whose authority was in theological and therefore political crisis. The cenotes, those natural sinkholes where the thin limestone surface collapsed to reveal the underground water table far below, occupied a unique and irreplaceable position in this sacred geography. They were not simply convenient water sources, though they served that function in areas of the Yucatan fortunate enough to have them in accessible locations. They were portals, openings in the surface of the world, through which the underworld, Xibalba, could be approached, through which offerings could be sent downward to the beings who govern the dark water beneath the earth, through which the reciprocal relationship between human civilization and supernatural power could be negotiated, maintained, and renewed. Objects of extraordinary value, jade ornaments, obsidian blades, your ceramic vessels of the finest quality, produced by the most skilled craftspeople in the city, were deposited in cenotes as offerings, not as waste, but as deliberate investment in the cosmic economy that kept the rain coming and the reservoirs full and the cities breathing. The reservoir, in this context, was not simply a water tank with plastered walls and a capacity measured in millions of gallons. It was a civic and sacred object, simultaneously, its fullness evidence of right relationship between the king and the divine forces that governed rainfall, its depletion, evidence of broken covenant, of a king who had failed his primary theological obligation. When classic Maya rulers commissioned monuments recording their achievements, they did not record only military victories and dynastic succession. They recorded hydraulic achievements, the construction and expansion of water infrastructure, the maintenance of the systems that kept the city alive, because in the political theology of the classic period, keeping the water flowing was not separable from keeping the world functioning correctly. The engineer and the priest were working on the same project. The reservoir and the temple were expressions of the same cosmological commitment. This fusion of the sacred and the practical was not a weakness in the system. For the majority of the classic period, it was a profound and durable source of collective strength, because it meant that the population's deepest religious commitments aligned perfectly with the behaviors required for collective survival. Maintaining the reservoir system was not just economically rational. It was spiritually obligatory. Participating in the communal labor required to keep the plaster sealed and the channels clear and the catchment surfaces functioning was not just civic duty, it was participation in the ongoing project of keeping the cosmos in order, of fulfilling the human side of the agreement with the forces that held the rain. But that same fusion carried within it a vulnerability that would only become visible under sufficient stress. when the system began to fail, when drought reduced reservoir levels, when contamination made people sick, when the water that was supposed to flow from right relationship with the divine began to carry the smell of something wrong. The failure was not simply practical, it was theological. It was cosmic evidence that something had broken in the relationship between the human world and the supernatural order, and the responses that the theological framework prescribed: more ritual, more sacrifice, more monumental construction, more intensive burning of limestone to produce plaster for new building projects, more trees removed from the already thinning forest, were responses that addressed the spiritual interpretation of the crisis, while making its material dimensions worse with every ceremony performed and every new temple raised. The waterkeeper standing at the edge of his city's reservoir, looking at water that had changed color in the night, did not have access to this full picture. He could not have. The change he was witnessing had been building across generations, accumulating in the sediment layer by invisible layer, approaching its threshold through increments too small for any single lifetime to perceive in full. He was living in the middle of a slow catastrophe, which is the most disorienting place to live, because from the inside, a slow catastrophe looks, for a very long time, almost exactly like ordinary life. The extraordinary cities that should never have existed had been built on a foundation of ingenuity so sophisticated it had sustained millions of people for centuries, and on a cosmology so coherent it had made maintaining that ingenuity feel like the most natural obligation in the world. Both the ingenuity and the cosmology were about to be tested by forces that had been building quietly and invisibly in the water that made everything possible. The test had already begun in the sediment, in the chemistry, in the slow, biological transformation of stored water into something a civilization could not survive. That is where we go next. The story of how the Maya poisoned their own water supply does not begin with a single decision or a catastrophic accident. It does not begin with negligence or ignorance or malice. It begins the way most slow catastrophes begin, with success, with a civilization doing exactly what it was designed to do, doing it well, doing it at increasing scale across increasing generations, and producing, as the invisible byproduct of all that success, the conditions for its own undoing. The poison was not separate from the civilization. It was the civilization's shadow, cast by the same light that made everything else visible and extraordinary and worth sustaining. To understand what happened to the water, you have to understand how we know what happened to the water, because the Maya left no written record of contamination, no chronicle describing the moment their reservoirs turned dangerous, no royal inscription acknowledging that the sacred water infrastructure was slowly killing the people it was built to sustain. The kings recorded their victories and their bloodletting rituals and their astronomical observations and their dynastic successions. They did not record the smell of the reservoir in the dry season, or the increase in childhood deaths, or the quiet accumulation of something wrong in the water that held the city together. What they left instead, entirely without intention, was sediment. At the bottom of every Maya reservoir, every aguada, every lake and pond, within the former urban zones of the classic lowlands, centuries of accumulated materials sit in undisturbed layers, each stratum representing a specific period of time, in each containing a chemical and biological record of what was happening in and around the water source. During the years it was deposited, pollen grains that document what plants were growing in the surrounding landscape, charcoal particles that record burning events and their frequency and intensity, isotope ratios that reflect rainfall patterns and temperature fluctuations across seasons and centuries, and chemical compounds, heavy metals, organic molecules, biological markers that preserve in extraordinary detail the story of what was entering the water supply and what was living and dying within it, across the full span of Maya urban occupation. Researchers from the University of Cincinnati, working at Tikal under the direction of geochemist David Lentz and his colleagues, extracted sediment cores from the city's major reservoir complexes, beginning in the 2010s, applying analytical techniques that had not existed a generation earlier to material that had been sitting undisturbed at the bottom of ancient water basins for over 1,000 years. What those cores revealed, layer by careful layer, was a record of contamination so detailed and so damning that it fundamentally changed how researchers understood the terminal classic collapse. Not as a story of external pressure overwhelming an otherwise functioning system, but as a story of a system generating, from within its own most essential and celebrated practices, the conditions that made its continuation impossible. The first, and in some ways most striking finding, was mercury. Mercury does not occur naturally in the Maya lowlands in concentrations that would be dangerous to human health. The geology of the Yucatan and Petén does not produce significant mercury deposits, and there are no volcanic sources in the immediate region that would introduce it into the environment through natural processes at dangerous levels. When researchers found mercury in Maya reservoir sediments, and they found it consistently at multiple sites in concentrations that in modern regulatory frameworks would trigger immediate emergency response and mandatory evacuation of any water system showing comparable readings, they knew with certainty that they were looking at something the Maya had introduced themselves, deliberately, repeatedly, and over a very long period of time. The source was cinnabar, mercury sulfide, a brilliantly red mineral that the Maya used with a devotion that can only be described as civilization-wide, woven into virtually every dimension of their sacred and political life. Cinnabar was the sacred red, the color of blood and sacrifice and royal power, the pigment that appeared on the most important objects and surfaces in the classic Maya world. It was ground into paint and applied to the exterior surfaces of temples and palaces. Those same plastered surfaces that functioned simultaneously as the catchment infrastructure of the hydraulic system that kept the city alive. Every time rain fell on a cinnabar-painted plaza surface, it dissolved a fraction of that pigment and carried it, in solution, toward the reservoir. The use of cinnabar extended far beyond architectural decoration. It was used in burial rituals of extraordinary intensity and scale. The bones of Maya rulers and elite individuals were painted with cinnabar before interment, their burial chambers coated in it from floor to ceiling, their jade ornaments and ceramic vessels and obsidian blades dusted with brilliant red powder. Entire royal interments transformed into chambers of concentrated mercury compound that archaeologists entering them for the first time have described as almost shockingly vivid, even after more than 1,000 years of sealed burial. The tomb of the ruler, Pakal, at Palenque, discovered in 1952, was so thoroughly saturated with cinnabar that the excavation team had to take precautions against acute mercury exposure simply from being in the chamber. This was not an exceptional case. This was standard Maya royal burial practice, replicated across dozens of elite interments at sites throughout the lowlands. Beyond burials, cinnabar appeared in dedicatory caches placed within the foundations of important buildings, at the beginning of construction, in ritual deposits associated with the completion of calendar cycles, in the cosmetic practices of elite individuals who painted their bodies for ceremonial occasions, in the pigments used by scribes producing the painted books and ceramic vessels that constituted the visual record of classic Maya, intellectual and religious life. Cinnabar was everywhere in the classic Maya world because cinnabar was sacred. because its brilliant red color resonated with the cosmological significance of blood and sacrifice, and the life force that coursed through the universe and required constant human maintenance through ritual action. And cinnabar is mercury sulfide, and mercury is among the most toxic substances a human being can be chronically exposed to. And when 600 years of rain fell on brilliantly painted plazas and temple facades that doubled as the city's primary water catchment surfaces, it carried that mercury, in solution and in particulate form, through the channels and drains and into the sealed reservoir basins, where it settled into the accumulating sediment and concentrated, year by year, ceremony by ceremony, across the full span of classic occupation. The sediment cores from Tikal's reservoirs showed mercury concentrations reaching levels many times above what modern environmental standards would classify as safe for any water source used for human consumption. The contamination was not uniform across the reservoir system. It was highest in the reservoirs most directly associated with the ceremonial core of the city, the basins that received runoff from the most heavily painted temple and palace surfaces, and lower and peripheral reservoirs, further from the architectural heart of the city's ritual life. This spatial pattern confirmed that the source was architectural pigment, washing off ceremonial structures, not some background environmental process. The sacred center of the city was the most contaminated part of the water system. The closer your reservoir sat to the temples, in the more mercury it held. In the layers corresponding to the terminal classic period, the concentrations were highest of all, reflecting both the accumulated legacy of centuries of cinnabar use and the strong likelihood that ritual activity intensified during the crisis years. More paint applied to more surfaces, more ceremonies performed, more desperate attempts to maintain the cosmic relationships that the droughts were visibly disrupting. The very act of intensifying religious practice, of painting the temples more brilliantly, of performing more dedicatory ceremonies, of doing more of the ritually correct things that a civilization does when it feels the world pulling away from order, was adding more mercury to the water that the population depended on. The cure and the poison were indistinguishable from each other within the framework available to the people performing the ceremonies. Mercury poisoning does not announce itself with dramatic symptoms that a pre-modern population would immediately associate with water contamination. It is slow, cumulative, and insidious in ways specifically calibrated to evade recognition. Chronic low-level mercury exposure produces neurological symptoms, tremors, progressive memory loss, difficulty concentrating, personality changes that manifest as increasing irritability, paranoia, and emotional instability that in a society without toxicology would be interpreted as illness of unknown origin, as spiritual affliction, as evidence of cosmic disorder rather than chemical poisoning. It produces kidney damage that progresses silently over years before manifesting as visible illness. It suppresses immune function, making exposed individuals more vulnerable to every other pathogen they encounter. It causes reproductive problems that reduce birth rates and increase rates of miscarriage and infant mortality in ways that would register as demographic decline without any obvious single cause. It makes populations weaker, sicker, and less capable of the sustained coordinated labor that maintaining hydraulic infrastructure requires. A population experiencing chronic mercury poisoning from its water supply would not know that is what was happening to them. They would only know that people were sick more often, that children were dying at rates that felt wrong, that the elders seemed to be losing their minds, that the city felt different from the way the story said it had once been, that something had changed in the relationship between the world and its inhabitants, without anyone being able to say precisely what or precisely when the change had begun. But mercury was not the only thing the sediment cores found. not by a significant distance. The biological record preserved in the Tikal Reservoir sediments showed something equally disturbing, accumulating through the late Classic and reaching crisis levels in the terminal Classic period. A dramatic and accelerating increase in cyanobacteria, the photosynthetic microorganisms, commonly called blue-green algae, whose blooms in warm, nutrient-rich, stagnant water produce some of the most potent natural toxins known to exist anywhere in the biological world. Cyanobacteria are ancient organisms, among the oldest life forms on Earth, present in aquatic environments for billions of years before the first human being ever cupped water in their hands and drank. Under normal conditions, in a healthy water body with sufficient flow, adequate depth, balanced nutrient levels, and sufficient biological diversity to keep any single species from dominating, they exist as a minor background component of the aquatic ecosystem, neither threatening nor particularly significant, but give them the right conditions. Warm temperatures sustained over weeks and months, still water with no circulation or aeration, high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus from organic waste and agricultural runoff flowing into the basin, sufficient sunlight penetrating a shallow water column, and they transform. They multiply with extraordinary speed, forming dense surface mats that turn the water green or blue-green, or sometimes a disturbing rust color, reminiscent of the cinnabar pigment washing off the temple walls above. They produce a characteristic foul smell that intensifies in the heat of afternoon, and they release into the water column a family of compounds called cyanotoxins, whose effects on mammalian biology are severe, varied, and in sufficient concentrations. Fatal. The Maya reservoirs of the terminal Classic period were, from a cyanobacterium's perspective, close to an ideal environment for explosive proliferation. The enclosed plastered basins had no natural flow. Water entered during rainfall events, and then sat, warming steadily in the tropical heat, with no current to introduce oxygen or disturb the surface layer where blooms concentrated. The population of tens of thousands of people generating organic waste in and around the city created an abundant and growing supply of nitrogen and phosphorus, flowing into the urban watershed through runoff and subsurface seepage. The progressive deforestation of the surrounding landscape, driven by the relentless demand for wood fuel to produce lime plaster and for agricultural land to feed growing populations, removed the forest buffer that had previously absorbed a substantial portion of that nutrient load before it could reach the reservoir basins. And during the drought years that characterized the terminal Classic climate, when reservoir levels dropped as consumption outpaced replenishment, the remaining water became shallower and more concentrated, the nutrient levels rising as the volume declined, and the temperature increasing as the depth decreased, the light penetration improving as the water column shortened. Every consequence of the drought made the conditions for cyanobacterial bloom formation more favorable, precisely at the moment when the water supply was most critically needed and most heavily consumed from the bottom of increasingly shallow basins. Cyanotoxins attack the human body through multiple pathways, depending on the specific compounds produced by the bloom in question. Hepatotoxins, the most abundant class produced by the genera most likely present in tropical Maya reservoirs, target liver tissue directly, causing acute liver failure and high-dose exposures and chronic progressive liver damage with sustained low-level exposure over weeks and months. Neurotoxins affect the central and peripheral nervous systems, producing symptoms that can include muscle paralysis, severe headaches, disorientation, and in acute cases, respiratory failure and death. Dermatotoxins cause irritation of skin and mucous membranes on contact, producing symptoms that would present across anyone using contaminated water for washing or bathing, as well as drinking. Cylindrospermopsins, caused multi-organ damage affecting the liver, kidneys, and spleen simultaneously. A population drinking from a reservoir experiencing active cyanobacterial bloom would have presented with a constellation of symptoms. Liver pain, presenting as upper abdominal tenderness, nausea, and vomiting. Neurological disturbances, ranging from headaches to more serious cognitive disruption, skin and eye irritation, in escalating mortality among the elderly and very young. That would have been terrifying and completely inexplicable within any diagnostic framework available to classic Maya medicine. There was no category for waterborne biological toxins in Maya medical knowledge. There was illness, and there was spiritual cause, and there was ritual remedy. The blooms in the reservoir would have read, to the priests and healers trying to understand what was happening to the population, as evidence of supernatural affliction on a citywide scale, as confirmation that the cosmic relationships sustaining the city had broken down in some fundamental way that demanded intensified ritual response. The researchers found evidence of these blooms preserved not just in the chemical markers left in the sediment, but in the biological remains themselves. Fragments of cyanobacterial cells surviving in the anaerobic conditions at the bottom of the reservoir basins, their presence in relative abundance across different time layers, providing a precise timeline of when conditions deteriorated, how quickly the degradation accelerated, and which reservoirs within the city's network became dangerous earliest. And then there was the third category of contamination, the one that required no exotic mineral compound or microscopic toxin-producing organism to explain. The one that was simply the inevitable and mathematically predictable consequence of concentrating tens of thousands of human beings in a water-stressed landscape, with no sanitation, infrastructure, remotely capable of managing the biological waste they produced every single day. Pathogenic contamination, fecal coliform bacteria, and the full range of enteric pathogens that follow wherever human waste enters a water supply without adequate treatment or dilution. The sediment cores showed markers for this category of contamination building steadily through the late Classic and reaching their highest concentrations in the terminal Classic layers, their progression tracking the population growth of the city with a grim and pitiless fidelity. More people meant more waste. More waste in a closed watershed meant more contamination of the water that everyone drank. More contamination meant more disease burden across the population. More disease meant more deaths, more weakened survivors, more disruption to the coordinated labor that kept the hydraulic infrastructure functioning, which degraded water quality further, which increased disease burden further, which reduced the population's capacity to respond. The feedback loop, once established beyond a certain threshold of contamination, became essentially self-reinforcing. Waterborne diseases that would have flourished in a pathogenically contaminated Maya reservoir include dysentery in multiple bacterial forms, typhoid fever, hepatitis A, giardia, cryptosporidium, and a range of intestinal parasites that cause chronic malnutrition, even in populations receiving technically adequate caloric intake, by destroying the gut's capacity to absorb the nutrients it ingests. These diseases fall hardest on the most vulnerable: children under 5, pregnant women, the elderly, anyone whose immune system was already compromised by other illness, or by the mercury exposure or cyanotoxin burden they were carrying simultaneously. At the population level, they produce elevated infant mortality, reduced average life expectancy, chronic illness that reduces agricultural productivity and labor availability, and the specific and devastating social stress of watching children die from causes that cannot be identified, cannot be prevented, and cannot be explained by any framework the culture possesses for understanding why the world sometimes withholds its mercy. What emerges from the sediment record when mercury contamination and cyanobacterial toxins and pathogenic loading are laid against each other in their temporal layers and read as a single integrated story, is a picture of compounding degradation that is almost architectural in its terrible coherence. Mercury contamination, built slowly and steadily from the earliest periods of intensive urban occupation, reaching dangerous concentrations by the late Classic, and remaining elevated thereafter. Its source, the ceremonies and pigments and sacred practices that were the most visible expressions of classic Maya civilization at its height. Cyanobacterial bloom frequency and intensity increased through the late Classic and accelerated sharply in the terminal Classic, tracking the deforestation and population growth curves with the precision of a chemical diary. Pathogenic contamination followed the population density curve most directly, growing with the city across the centuries of its expansion and declining only as the city itself declined, its concentration in the sediment, a record of human presence rendered in the language of biological waste. None of these were sudden events that arrived with the dramatic announcement of a genuine catastrophe. None could be pointed to as the moment everything changed, the day the water became dangerous, the year the system crossed from functioning to failing. They were the slow and remorseless arithmetic of a civilization's success, adding up, across hundreds of years and thousands of unremarkable days, to a sum that the civilization could not survive and could not see coming until it had already arrived. The waterkeeper crouching at the reservoir's edge on that dry season night was looking at the visible surface of something that had been building in the sediment beneath his feet for longer than any living person could remember. The color change he saw, the smell that reached him across the still dark air, were not the beginning of the problem. They were the moment the problem finally became large enough to perceive without instruments, without scientific training, without any framework beyond the ordinary human capacity to notice that the world looked different from the way it had looked before. He could see the water had changed. He could not see the mercury settled in the sediment below it. He could not identify the cyanobacterial cells multiplying in the warm shallows. He could not count the pathogens suspended in the water column between his lamp and the far wall of the basin. He could only notice and report and hope that the priests would know what ceremony to perform. They did not. But the drought that was already forming in the climate patterns above the Yucatan would arrive soon enough to make the question of ceremony feel, in retrospect, almost beside the point. There is a cave in the Maya mountains of Belize called Belize Blue Hole, and inside it, layered into the walls of its submerged cavern system, is one of the most precise climate records ever recovered from the ancient Americas. Stalagmites grow slowly, adding material year by year as mineral-laden water drips from cave ceilings and deposits its dissolved content in accumulating columns of calcium carbonate. The chemistry of each year's deposit reflects the chemistry of that year's rainfall, its volume, its isotopic composition, its relationship to the broader atmospheric patterns governing precipitation across the entire Yucatan region. Read correctly, a stalagmite is a year-by-year diary of the climate, written in stone over centuries, patient and indifferent and immune to the political pressures and theological interpretations that shaped every human record the Maya themselves produced. The stone does not remember what the king wanted people to believe. It remembers only what the rain actually did. What the stalagmites of Belize and the sediment records of the Yucatan's lakes record for the period between approximately 800 and 1000 AD is unambiguous and consistent across every independent proxy that researchers have examined. The rains failed, not completely, not all at once, not in the single catastrophic drought that popular accounts of the Maya collapse sometimes describe for the sake of narrative simplicity, but in a series of severe multi-year drought episodes that hit the lowlands in relentless pulses, in each one reducing reservoir levels before the previous deficit had been fully recovered, each one arriving before the landscape had time to stabilize and regenerate, each one compounding the damage left by the one before, in a sequence of climatic pressure that the hydraulic system the Maya had spent centuries building was simply not designed to withstand at that frequency and duration, and against the backdrop of already severely degraded water quality. The paleoclimatologist Douglas Kennett and his colleagues, analysing speleothem records from multiple Belizean cave systems and correlating them with the lake sediment cores from across the Yucatan Peninsula, identified a series of pronounced drought episodes between approximately 820 and 910 AD that align with striking precision to the archaeological evidence for urban abandonment and population decline across the southern Maya lowlands. The correspondence is not perfect in every detail. Archaeology rarely produces perfect correspondence with climate records because human responses to environmental stress are mediated by politics and culture and individual decision-making and the particular circumstances of specific cities in ways that blur the clean lines that climate data alone might draw. But the broad pattern, examined across dozens of sites and multiple independent lines of evidence, is unmistakable. The droughts came, the cities emptied, the timing was not coincidental, and the relationship between the climate signal and the archaeological record is now one of the most thoroughly documented cases of climate-driven societal stress in the entire archaeological literature. What made these droughts so specifically and almost perfectly catastrophic for the classic Maya was not simply their severity in absolute terms. Droughts had occurred before in the Maya lowlands. The climate of the Yucatan Peninsula had never been perfectly reliable, and the hydraulic system the Maya built had been designed with the knowledge that dry years would come, that some years would deliver less rainfall than others, that the system needed buffers and reserves capable of carrying the population through seasonal and interannual variability in precipitation. The engineers who designed Tikal's reservoir complex were not naive about the climate they were building for. They had engineered substantial overcapacity precisely because they understood that the margin between adequate water and insufficient water, in a landscape with no natural backup sources, had to be maintained deliberately and consistently. The terminal classic droughts were not simply worse than previous droughts in degree, they were different in character, sequential, compounding, arriving in a period when the system's buffers had already been compromised by the contamination processes that had been building across the preceding centuries. A reservoir system operating at full capacity and delivering clean water could survive a multi-year drought by drawing down reserves while waiting for recovery. A reservoir system already compromised by mercury accumulation and cyanobacterial loading and pathogenic contamination, already delivering water that was making people sick, had a fundamentally different relationship to drought than a clean system would. Drought did not simply reduce the quantity of available water, it concentrated the contamination that was already present, reduced the dilution that had been moderating its effects, and transformed a chronic slow-building crisis into something acute. To understand the specific mechanism, consider what happens to a Maya reservoir during a severe drought year. The wet season delivers less rainfall than the previous year, meaning the basin ends the rains at a lower level than it began the dry season. The dry season then proceeds to draw that reduced supply down through consumption, drinking, cooking, limited irrigation of the most critical food crops, the basic biological requirements of tens of thousands of people with no alternative source. By the end of the dry season, the reservoir is at its lowest point of the year, holding only the deepest, oldest, most concentrated water in the basin. The water that has been sitting longest, that has accumulated the highest density of settled contaminants, that sits closest to the sediment layer, where mercury concentrations are highest, and where the disturbance of lowered water levels is releasing previously sequestered toxins back into the water column, Now add a second consecutive drought year to that scenario. The wet season replenishes the basin partially but not fully. The dry season draws it down again from an already reduced starting point. The water available at the end of the second dry season is more concentrated, more contaminated, drawn from layers that sat even closer to the sediment, held in a shallower basin, whose warmer temperatures and higher nutrient concentrations are creating bloom conditions of increasing intensity. And the population drinking this water is already weakened by the first drought year's nutritional stress, by the cumulative mercury burden of years of contaminated water, by the cyanotoxin exposure that has been damaging liver function and suppressing immune response. They are drinking worse water while being less able to tolerate its effects. A third consecutive drought year begins to produce conditions that no amount of management or rationing or ritual response can address. The reservoir is approaching levels that the system's designers had probably never anticipated as an operational scenario. The water it holds is, in modern terms, severely contaminated across multiple categories, simultaneously: heavy metal, biological toxin, and pathogenic. And the population consuming it is experiencing compounding health crises that are reducing its capacity to perform the agricultural and maintenance work required to sustain itself. The feedback loops that were already operating slowly during the late Classic period are now spinning faster, each rotation tightening the constraint on survival. The political consequences of sustained drought in a civilization whose kingship was theologically inseparable from the guarantee of rainfall were not slow to manifest. They were immediate, cascading, and ultimately irreversible in a way that no political system without those specific theological commitments would have experienced in quite the same way. The Maya king was not simply an administrator or a military commander or a hereditary aristocrat whose authority rested on the loyalty of his subordinates and the efficiency of his bureaucracy. He was the axis around which the cosmic relationships sustaining the city revolved, the ritual specialist whose bloodletting and sacrifice and astronomical knowledge maintained the reciprocal exchange between the human world and the supernatural forces that govern rain and fertility and agricultural abundance. His legitimacy was not merely political, it was cosmic, validated by material reality in the most direct and observable way imaginable. Every year that the rains came on schedule, every year that the reservoirs filled and the harvest sustained the population, was a year in which the king's claim to be the mediator between his people and the divine order was confirmed by the simple fact that people were eating and drinking and alive. The theology and the hydrology pointed in the same direction, and the king stood at their intersection. When the rains stopped coming, that convergence became a divergence, and the divergence was catastrophic for royal authority in ways that no amount of military force or political maneuvering could fully address. The king performed more elaborate ceremonies, commissioning more elaborate ritual performances at greater expense to the city's already stressed resource base. He bled himself more extensively at the calendar-ordained occasions that required royal blood to maintain the cosmic compact. He commissioned more monuments, more stelae recording his astronomical credentials and his connections to the founding ancestors whose divine authority he claimed to inherit and embody, more architectural projects demonstrating his ability to mobilize labor and resources in the service of cosmic maintenance. He escalated every ritual response available within the theological framework of classic Maya kingship. The rains did not return on schedule. The reservoirs continued their slow descent toward levels that had no precedent in living memory or institutional record. The population continued to suffer the compounding effects of contaminated water, reduced food supply, and the specific psychological and social stress of watching a system that had always worked simply stop working without any explanation that existing knowledge could provide. The archaeological record of the Terminal Classic period shows this escalation with a painful and legible clarity. Monument construction. The carving and erection of stone stelae, recording royal dates, achievements, and cosmic credentials, intensified at many sites during the early Terminal Classic, even as population was declining and the resources required for such construction were becoming visibly scarcer. The final monuments at sites like Tikal, Inkurigua, and Karakol carry increasingly emphatic assertions of royal authority and cosmic connection, statements about the king's relationship with the divine, and his mastery of the astronomical and ritual knowledge required to sustain the world that read in the full context of everything happening around them, like arguments addressed to an audience that has stopped being convinced. The last dated monument at Tikal was erected in 869 AD. After that, silence. The scribes stopped carving. The stonecutters laid down their tools. The king stopped commissioning records of their cosmic authority, which suggests either that they no longer had the resources to commission them, or that they had lost confidence in the authority those monuments were meant to assert. The city did not fall in a single catastrophic moment. It simply, over the course of years and then decades, stopped insisting on its own significance. The intensified ritual activity of the Terminal Classic period also had direct, measurable, and deeply damaging material consequences for the hydraulic system that the theological escalation was supposed to address and restore. More monument construction meant more lime plaster production for the new architectural projects that accompanied each major ritual commission. More plaster production meant more wood fuel, more burning, and more consumption from forest reserves that were already severely depleted from centuries of the same demand at smaller scale. More deforestation of the surrounding landscape meant more soil erosion during the rainfall events that did occur, increased sediment loading into the reservoir basins, more nutrient runoff flowing into water supplies already struggling with bloom conditions. The theological response to the drought was, in its material consequences, making the drought's effects worse with every ceremony performed and every new building plastered in fresh white lime. The priests were adding fuel to the fire they were trying to extinguish, and there was no framework available to them within which that terrible irony was visible. The drought also fundamentally transformed the strategic logic of intercity warfare across the Terminal Classic lowlands, and the warfare that resulted was qualitatively different from the classic period conflicts that had preceded it in ways that made recovery from the broader crisis much less likely. Classic Maya warfare operated within a set of broadly shared conventions that limited its most destructive potential. The primary military objectives were the capture of elite prisoners for sacrifice, the extraction of tribute from subordinated rivals, and the demonstration of martial superiority, sufficient to compel favorable diplomatic arrangements. Defeated cities continued to function under these conventions. They lost prestige, sometimes lost subordinate centers or trade routes, sometimes lost ruling dynasties to replacement by victorious rivals. But the infrastructure of daily life, including the hydraulic systems that sustained urban populations, was generally not the target. Destroying an enemy's reservoir served no classic period military purpose, because the political goal was a subordinated city that could pay tribute, not a depopulated ruin that could pay nothing. Terminal Classic warfare abandoned those conventions with a thoroughness that the archaeological record documents across multiple sites and regions. When water became the absolute limiting factor for urban survival, when the difference between a city maintaining its population and a city losing it was measured in reservoir capacity, the hydraulic infrastructure of rival cities became the most strategically valuable military target imaginable. Destroying or contaminating an enemy's water supply in a landscape with no alternative water sources was not merely a military tactic. It was an existential strike, and the evidence from Terminal Classic destruction layers at multiple sites shows that it was employed with a deliberateness that suggests military planners understood exactly what they were doing. The archaeological site of Oaxaca in Guatemala provides one of the most viscerally immediate examples of what Terminal Classic warfare produced at its most acute. The city was attacked and burned around 810 AD in an assault of such speed and completeness that its residents fled in the middle of daily activities, leaving meals on hearths and craft projects mid-completion and personal possessions scattered across floors in the distribution of panicked abandonment rather than organized departure. The preservation of that single catastrophic moment is remarkable. Archaeologists excavating the burned elite residential complex found a snapshot of ordinary life interrupted by sudden violence that has been compared, in its completeness, to the frozen moment at Pompeii. The attack was not aimed at political subordination or tribute extraction. It was aimed at elimination, at the permanent removal of the city as a functioning entity, and it succeeded. Other sites across the Terminal Classic lowlands show evidence of deliberate reservoir fouling, the deposition of organic material, refuse, and in some cases human remains into enemy water supplies in quantities that would dramatically accelerate pathogenic contamination and bloom formation in systems already near their tolerance limits. This was not incidental to military operations. It was a specific and intentional tactic, the ancient equivalent of poisoning a well applied to hydraulic systems that were both the most critical infrastructure in the enemy city, and given their already degraded state, the most vulnerable to additional contamination stress. A reservoir system operating at the edge of tolerable contamination could be pushed past that edge by relatively modest additional input. The military planners of the Terminal Classic appear to have understood this, because the pattern of deliberate contamination appears at too many sites in too consistent a form to be accidental. Warfare that systematically targeted the infrastructure without which urban life in the Maya lowlands was impossible did not produce the political reorganization that classic period warfare had typically generated, new dominant powers extracting tribute from subordinated rivals within a continuing regional system. It produced abandonment on a scale and at a speed that exceeded even the already severe depopulation driven by drought and contaminated water. Cities whose reservoirs were destroyed or fouled had no path to recovery. They had no alternative water sources to fall back on, no means of sustaining their populations while rebuilding hydraulic infrastructure, no option except dispersal into a landscape that could support small mobile groups drawing on seasonal water sources, but could not support the concentrated urban populations that classic civilization required. The point of no return arrived differently for each city, because each city had a different starting position in terms of reservoir capacity, contamination level, surrounding forest cover, political stability, and the specific sequence of drought years and military pressures it faced. But the direction of travel was the same across the entire southern lowland region, and by the middle of the 9th century, it was irreversible. The system that had made the impossible cities possible had been degraded past the threshold at which any realistic recovery effort could restore it to the condition required to sustain urban populations of classic period scale. The waterkeeper who noticed the wrong colour in the reservoir on that dry season night was living somewhere in the long middle of this process, after the threshold of serious contamination had been crossed, but before the final crisis made the situation undeniable to everyone. He was living in the period when the evidence was visible to those who looked closely and ignored by those who found other explanations more comfortable. He was living in the time when the question of what to do was still theoretically open. even as the compounding of drought and contamination and political fracture and military destruction was closing it, month by month and year by year, toward an answer that no one in the city wanted to face. The people who faced it, who made the decision to leave, who gathered what they could carry and walked away from the cities their ancestors had built in a waterless landscape through sheer engineering will, did not experience their departure as the end of Maya civilization. They experienced it as survival. And what they built from that survival is a story that the standard narrative of Maya collapse almost entirely fails to tell. There is a particular quality to the silence that settles over an emptying city. It is not the silence of a place that was never inhabited. That is simply quiet, neutral, the absence of sound in a space that never expected it. The silence of a city that is losing its people is different. It is the silence of spaces designed for crowds that are no longer crowded, of marketplaces where the vendors have thinned, of temple precincts where the ceremonial gatherings draw fewer participants each cycle, of neighborhoods where the houses on one side of a courtyard stand empty, while the families on the other side pretend not to notice. It is a silence that arrives incrementally, that no single person can point to as beginning on a specific day, that everyone living through it experiences as a gradual and deeply unsettling change in the texture of daily life, without ever being able to identify the precise moment when the change became irreversible. This is the silence that descended on the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands across the 8th and 9th centuries AD. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the patient, grinding persistence of a process that had been building for longer than anyone alive could remember, finally becoming visible in the rhythms of ordinary life, in the markets, in the temples, in the reservoirs that sat lower each dry season than they had the dry season before. What did the people living through this process actually experience? What did they see and smell and feel as the crisis deepened around them? What did they understand about what was happening, and what remained invisible to them within the frameworks their civilization provided for making sense of the world? Begin with the water itself, because the water was where the crisis was most immediately and personally experienced by every person in the city, regardless of their social position or political awareness. By the terminal classic period, the reservoirs that supplied the major southern lowland cities were delivering water that was perceptibly wrong in ways that required no scientific training to detect. The color had shifted. Water that should have been relatively clear carried the blue-green or rust-tinged discoloration of active cyanobacterial bloom, visible to anyone drawing from the basin in morning light. The smell was different. The organic, slightly sweet, a deeply wrong odor of a biological system in crisis, detectable on still mornings when the air over the reservoir surface carried it toward the city. The taste, for those who drank it, was altered in ways that the body registers below the level of conscious analysis, triggering the instinctive revulsion that human biology has developed over millions of years of evolution to signal that water is dangerous. People knew, in the way that bodies know things before minds can articulate them, that something was wrong with the water. They drank it anyway, because there was no other water, because the alternative to drinking compromised water was dying of thirst, because the dry season stretched for 7 months, and the next rains were always somewhere between weeks and months away. They drank it, and they got sick, and the sickness was interpreted not as evidence of chemical or biological contamination. Those concepts did not exist in classic Maya epistemology, but as evidence of spiritual affliction, of cosmic imbalance, of the body manifesting the disorder that existed in the relationship between the human world and the divine forces that governed health and illness, and the basic functioning of the natural order. The symptoms that would have presented across the terminal classic urban population, paint a picture of collective suffering that the archaeological record confirms through skeletal analysis at multiple sites. Researchers examining human remains from terminal classic contexts at cities including Copan have documented elevated rates of skeletal markers for chronic nutritional stress. The kind of bone pathology that develops when bodies are consistently unable to absorb adequate nutrients, consistent with the gut damage produced by chronic cyanotoxin and pathogenic exposure. They have found evidence of increased infectious disease burden in the bone lesions and dental pathologies of terminal classic individuals compared to earlier periods. They have found demographic signatures, elevated child mortality, reduced adult life expectancy, declining population density in occupation layers, that together describe a population under severe and sustained biological stress from causes that operated continuously rather than in single acute episodes. Children were dying at rates that parents who had survived their own childhoods in the same city would have recognized as wrong, as different from what they had expected, as evidence that the world their children were growing up in was not the world they themselves had grown up in. Elders were losing cognitive function in patterns that manifested as behavioral change, as the irritability and memory loss and personality disruption that chronic mercury poisoning produces, and that within the cultural framework available would have been interpreted as spiritual possession, or divine punishment, or simple the mysterious failing of age. Working-age adults were losing productive capacity to the liver damage and immune suppression that cyanotoxin exposure produces, finding themselves unable to sustain the agricultural and maintenance labor that the city required of them, experiencing the specific helplessness of bodies that are willing but no longer fully capable. The Maya response to this gathering crisis was shaped entirely by the interpretive framework their civilization provided, and that framework located the cause of collective suffering not in the chemistry of stored water, but in the state of the relationship between the human community and the supernatural powers that governed the world's functioning. If the city was sick, if the rains were failing, if the harvests were thin and the children were dying and the reservoirs were low, the explanation was cosmic disorder and the remedy was ritual intensification, more ceremony, more sacrifice, and more bloodletting by the king and the nobility, whose ritual obligations required them to offer their own blood as the most direct form of communication with the divine. The archaeological record of terminal classic ritual activity documents this intensification with a thoroughness that, read against the environmental evidence, carries a particular kind of tragedy. Dedicatory caches deposited in and near water sources. The ritual offerings intended to maintain the sacred relationship between the community and the water that sustained it. Increase in frequency and elaborateness through the terminal classic period at multiple sites. The objects deposited become more valuable, more carefully selected, more evidently produced at greater cost to communities that were simultaneously experiencing resource scarcity. Jade and obsidian and fine ceramics, and at some sites, human sacrifice went into the reservoirs and cenotes and water-associated ritual deposits of cities that were running out of the food and water and population needed to survive, as if the cosmic debt that was expressed in suffering could be paid down through sufficiently generous offering. The construction of new temples and monuments continued at sites across the southern lowlands, well into the terminal classic period, consuming resources, labor, food to sustain that labor, wood fuel for lime production, the organizational capacity of a political system under increasing stress that from a purely material perspective would have been better directed toward hydraulic infrastructure repair and agricultural intensification. But the decision to build temples rather than repair reservoirs was not irrational within the framework that governed it. If the cause of the crisis was spiritual disorder, then addressing the spiritual disorder through the construction of monuments that embodied right cosmic relationship, was addressing the actual problem. The material and the spiritual were not separate categories in classic Maya thought. The temple was the intervention, the ceremony was the treatment, the blood offered at the monument was the medicine. That the medicine was not working was becoming undeniable by the middle of the 9th century. And the undeniability of its failure, the fact that the ceremonies continued, and the rains continued their irregularity, and the reservoirs continued their decline, was itself a form of evidence, within the theological framework, that something had broken at a level more fundamental than any available ritual could address. The response, ultimately, was departure, and understanding what Maya urban abandonment actually looked like from the inside requires abandoning the dramatic imagery of sudden exodus that the word collapse tends to invoke. People did not leave Tikal, or Copan, or Karakol in single coordinated waves of mass migration, gathering their possessions and marching away from empty streets toward uncertain destinations. They left the way. People always leave places that are no longer working, gradually, quietly, in the decisions of individual families who had concluded that their prospects elsewhere were better than their prospects staying, who packed what they could carry and joined the trickle of departures that over years and decades became a stream and eventually a flood that left behind only those too sick or too old or too stubborn or too committed to their place in the institutional structure to go. The archaeological evidence for this gradual abandonment is legible in the occupation sequences at major sites. The peripheral neighborhoods, the residential areas farthest from the ceremonial core, occupied by the lower status populations who had the least investment in the city's political and religious institutions, and the most flexibility to relocate, show declining occupation earlier than the elite residential zones and the temple precincts. The city shrank from its edges inward, its institutional core persisting longest as the population that had sustained it dispersed into the surrounding landscape and beyond. Where did they go? The answer is one of the most important and least told parts of the Maya collapse story, because it fundamentally complicates the narrative of catastrophic civilizational failure that the word collapse implies. They went north, toward the coast, toward the cenotes, the northern Yucatan Peninsula, which sits atop the same limestone karst geology as the southern lowlands, but at a latitude and elevation where the water table sits closer to the surface, is dotted with cenotes, those natural sinkholes that provide direct access to groundwater, independent of the reservoir infrastructure that was failing in the south. The cenotes of the northern Yucatan do not depend on annual rainfall-filling engineered storage basins. They draw from aquifers that recharge across broad catchment areas and that provide reliable water access, even through drought years, that would empty a surface reservoir. They represent a fundamentally different relationship between human settlement and water availability, one that was not vulnerable to the specific failure mode that had destroyed the southern cities. Cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, drawing on cenote water rather than reservoir systems, rose to regional prominence precisely during the period when the southern lowland centers were declining. Chichen Itza, whose sacred cenote became one of the most ritually significant water bodies in the entire Maya world, expanded its political reach through the terminal classic and early post-classic periods, absorbing population from the declining south and developing new architectural and political forms that represented genuine innovation, rather than mere imitation of what had come before. The people who built Chichen Itza's terminal classic and post-classic monuments were not a different people from those who had built Tikal's classic period temples. They were, in many cases, their descendants, carrying with them the astronomical knowledge and the architectural expertise and the cosmological frameworks that classic civilization had developed, adapting those inheritances to new circumstances and new water sources in ways that produced a post-classic Maya culture that was different from what had preceded it, but continuous with it in every meaningful way. The documentary sources that survived from the post-classic period and the early colonial era, the books of Chilam Balam, prophetic and historical texts maintained in Yucatec Maya communities through the colonial period, and the accounts recorded after Spanish contact by Maya writers and Spanish observers, preserve traces of how the terminal classic period was understood and remembered within the civilization's own tradition. These sources speak of the abandonment of the southern cities in terms that are simultaneously practical and cosmic. Descriptions of places where the food failed, and the water failed, and the divine compact that had sustained the community was broken beyond local repair, requiring departure toward new places where that compact could be renewed under different conditions with different leadership. The Chilam Balam texts speak of the ending of Katuns, the major 20-year periods of the Maya calendar, as times of transformation and upheaval, of the overthrow of existing orders and the establishment of new ones, in language that may preserve cultural memory of the terminal classic collapse, filtered through the cosmological framework that gave it meaning. The collapse was not remembered, in these texts, as simple defeat or catastrophe. It was remembered as transformation, painful, disorienting, costly in human terms, beyond calculation, but ultimately navigable because the people who lived through it carried with them everything that had made their civilization worth building in the first place. 7 million Maya people are alive today. They speak languages descended directly from the languages spoken in the cities that the terminal classic crisis emptied. They maintain traditions of astronomical observation and agricultural practice and cosmological understanding that trace continuous lineages back through the post-classic and the terminal classic to the classic period civilization that built Tikal and Copan and Coracol on a waterless limestone plain. Through sheer engineering, will, and collective human determination, the cities fell. The people did not. The knowledge survived. The identity persisted. The civilization transformed rather than ended, adapted rather than disappeared, found a water where water was available, and built new things in new places, and continued, as human communities always continue, to make meaning from the circumstances they found themselves inhabiting. The waterkeeper who noticed the change in the reservoir did not know he was living at the beginning of the end of his city. He knew only that something was wrong with the water, and that the city around him was the only world he had ever known, and that the question of what to do about the thing that was wrong was larger than any single person standing at the edge of a reservoir in the dark could answer alone. The answer, when it came slowly and at enormous cost, but it came. And what it produced, on the other side of the crisis, is the evidence that civilizations are more resilient than their most catastrophic moments suggest. That the people who survive the fall of cities carry within them everything necessary to build again, somewhere else, in a different way, toward a future that the crisis made unimaginable but did not make impossible. There is a temptation, when confronting a story like this one, to reach for distance, to file it under ancient history, under the category of things that happened to other people in other times, under conditions so different from our own, that the comparison requires too much imaginative effort to feel urgent. The Maya were a pre-industrial civilization, operating without modern chemistry or microbiology or environmental science. They could not have known what was happening to their water in the way that we would know, with our instruments and our regulatory frameworks and our accumulated scientific understanding of how cyanobacteria reproduce, and how mercury moves through biological systems, and how pathogens spread through shared water supplies. The tragedy was real. but it was the tragedy of people who lacked the tools to see what was killing them. Surely that particular tragedy belongs to the past. This is a comfortable thought. It is also, the evidence suggests, not entirely accurate. In 2014, the municipal water system of Flint, Michigan, in the United States, was switched to draw from the Flint River as a cost-saving measure. The river water was more corrosive than the previous source, and it leached lead from the aging pipes that carried it to residents' taps. Lead is a heavy metal with neurological effects that in children cause irreversible cognitive damage, even at low levels of chronic exposure. For 18 months, officials at multiple levels of government received reports of discolored water, of unusual taste and smell, of elevated lead levels in children's blood, and responded with reassurances that the water was safe. The population of Flint, predominantly low income, predominantly people of color, a community with limited political power relative to the institutional authority of the officials managing their water supply, continue to drink and cook with and bathe their children in water that was poisoning those children, because the alternative, accepting that the institutions responsible for protecting them had failed catastrophically, was too large and too disruptive for those institutions to acknowledge, until the evidence became impossible to suppress. The parallel to the Maya situation is not perfect. No parallel across 13 centuries of technological and social change could be, but the structural elements are present and recognizable. A population depending on centralized water infrastructure, it does not control. Contamination accumulating in that infrastructure from sources connected to the normal functioning of the surrounding civilization. Warning signs visible to those who looked closely, interpreted through frameworks that did not recognize contamination as the primary explanation. Institutional responses calibrated to manage the narrative of safety, rather than the reality of danger. And the heaviest burden, falling on the population least able to demand accountability or access alternatives. The Maya case is not a story about primitive people failing to understand their world. It is a story about the way that civilizational systems generate the conditions of their own degradation through the normal operation of their most essential functions, and about the difficulty, not the impossibility, but the genuine structural difficulty of perceiving that process from inside it while it is underway. Consider what has happened to water quality in the agricultural heartlands of the developed world over the past century. The runoff from industrialized agriculture, the nitrogen and phosphorus from synthetic fertilizers that drain from fields into rivers and lakes and coastal waters, has created cyanobacterial bloom conditions at a scale the Maya never approached. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone, a region of oxygen-depleted water off the Louisiana coast, caused by agricultural runoff flowing down the Mississippi River, covers an area measured in thousands of square miles during peak summer conditions. Lake Erie, one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world, experienced a cyanobacterial bloom in 2014 that contaminated the drinking water supply of the city of Toledo, Ohio, leaving 400,000 people without safe water for 3 days. The Chesapeake Bay, the largest estuary in the United States, has experienced decades of degraded water quality, driven by nutrient runoff from the agricultural and urban landscapes of its watershed, producing dead zones and bloom conditions that have devastated the aquatic ecosystems that millions of people depend on for food and livelihood. These are not Maya-scale catastrophes, because the societies experiencing them have scientific knowledge, institutional capacity, and technological resources that the terminal classic Maya did not possess. They can identify the contamination, quantify the damage, model the future trajectory, and implement interventions if the political will to do so exists, if the economic interests arrayed against intervention can be overcome. if the distance between the people making decisions about agricultural runoff and the people whose water supply those decisions affect does not insulate the decision makers from the consequences of their choices in ways that make change too easy to defer, that last condition is doing a great deal of work, and it is where the Maya story becomes most directly relevant to the present, not as a precise analogy, but as a structural template for understanding how civilizations relate to the environmental consequences of their own functioning. The Maya did not poison their water supply because they were negligent or ignorant or indifferent to their own survival. They poisoned it because the practices that poisoned it, the cinnabar ceremonies, the deforestation for agriculture and plaster production, the concentration of population in urban centers, were the same practices that expressed their highest values, sustained their food supply, and maintained the political and religious systems that gave their civilization coherence and meaning. The poison was not separate from the civilization. It was generated by the civilization's most essential operations, and separating it from those operations would have required the civilization to be fundamentally different from what it was. This is not a comfortable observation to sit with, because it suggests that the relationship between civilizational success and environmental degradation is not primarily a story of ignorance that knowledge can straightforwardly correct, or of negligence that better regulation can prevent, or of a few bad actors whose removal would leave the underlying system functional and sustainable. It suggests something more structurally challenging, that the normal operation of complex, successful civilizations generates environmental consequences that accumulate faster than those civilizations' institutional and cultural frameworks can recognize and respond to, and that this dynamic is not unique to any particular civilization or any particular period of history. What the Maya archaeology cannot tell us, and what the limits of the evidence require honest acknowledgement of, is the internal deliberation that preceded and accompanied the crisis. We do not have records of debates within Maya cities about the relationship between cinnabar use and water quality, because no such conceptual framework existed within which that debate could have been formulated. We do not know whether anyone argued for different approaches to water management or resource use, because the records that might have preserved such arguments either were not made or did not survive. We cannot reconstruct the individual decisions and conversations and political negotiations that preceded the abandonment of specific cities, because archaeology recovers patterns and material signatures, but not the private reasoning of individuals who left no written account of their choices. These gaps are not trivial. They are the difference between a story about a civilization that saw its crisis coming and failed to respond, and a story about a civilization that was navigating a crisis whose full dimensions were structurally invisible from inside it. The second story is sadder, in some ways, than the first. The first story preserves the comfort of believing that sufficient knowledge and sufficient will would have been enough. The second story asks harder questions about the limits of what any civilization can perceive about itself, while it is still fully embedded in the assumptions and practices that generate its most serious problems. The concept of the slow-moving catastrophe, the crisis that develops across generations rather than lifetimes, that produces no single moment of obvious emergency, that looks from inside like ordinary life becoming incrementally less sustainable, is one of the most important and least comfortable contributions that the Maya collapse story makes to contemporary understanding. The Maya family drawing water from a contaminated reservoir in 850 AD was not making a different decision from their grandparents drawing water from the same reservoir in 750 AD. The practice was unchanged. The ritual context was maintained. The water looked different, smelled different, tasted wrong in ways the body registered without the mind being able to name. But the alternative, acknowledging that the city's most fundamental infrastructure had become a source of death rather than life, required a cognitive and social leap that no individual family standing at the reservoir's edge could make alone. Collective recognition of slow-moving catastrophe requires institutions capable of aggregating individual observations into systemic understanding, and the willingness of those institutions to prioritize accurate diagnosis over the maintenance of narratives that sustain existing power arrangements. The Maya had extraordinary institutions for many purposes. They did not have institutions designed for the specific task of recognizing and communicating that their most sacred infrastructure was killing them. And even if they had possessed such institutions, the political cost of using them, the implications for royal authority of acknowledging that the king's sacred water system was a source of mass poisoning rather than divine provision, would have been enormous. What survived the collapse is, ultimately, the most important part of the story. Not because it makes the suffering that preceded it acceptable, or the loss of the southern cities anything less than a genuine catastrophe for the hundreds of thousands of people who lived through the decline, but because it demonstrates the actual resilience of human civilization when stripped of the specific institutional and infrastructural forms that were failing. The astronomical knowledge that classic Maya scholars had developed over centuries of observation and record-keeping did not disappear with the abandonment of Tikal. It was carried north in the memories and manuscripts of the scribes and priests who relocated to the post-classic centers, where it continued to develop and was eventually recorded in the surviving books. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, that preserve some of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian astronomical calculations known to exist anywhere in the ancient world. The agricultural knowledge encoded in the Maya Milpa system, the intercropping of maize and beans and squash that had sustained lowland populations for millennia, survived and adapted to new landscapes and new water conditions. The language communities that had developed across the classic period lowlands continued, fragmenting and evolving across the post-classic and colonial periods into the 30-odd Mayan languages spoken today by 7 million people whose connection to the classic period civilization is direct, biological, and cultural in every meaningful sense. The cities fell, the knowledge endured, the people persisted, the civilization transformed into something different from what it had been, carrying its inheritances into new circumstances and building from them new forms of community and meaning and practice that were neither simple continuations of what had come before nor complete breaks from it, but the genuinely creative response of human beings who had survived something enormous and were doing what human beings always do in the aftermath of enormous things, making something from what remained. And so we return, at the end, into where we began, the waterkeeper crouching at the reservoir's edge on that dry season night, his lamp casting its small circle of amber light across water that had changed color in the dark, smelling something that his body understood as wrong before his mind could name it. He did not know he was living through the terminal classic collapse. He did not know about cyanobacteria or mercury sulfide or pathogenic contamination, or the sediment layers recording centuries of accumulation beneath the basin floor where he crouched. He knew only that the water smelled different, and that the city behind him was the only world he had ever known, and that whatever this change meant, it would need to be reported in the morning, and the priests would be consulted, and the appropriate ceremonies would be performed. He was a real person, or someone very like him was. The change he noticed was real. The water that carried the smell that reached him across the still night air was genuinely dangerous in ways that would kill people he knew, people he lived among, perhaps people he loved. The crisis that his small observation sat at the edge of was real, and it was vast, and it had been building for longer than his civilization's memory could reach. He could not see all of that from where he crouched. Neither can we from where we stand, but we can look at what the sediment remembers. We can read what the stone records. We can follow the evidence that survives in layers and cores and bone and ruin, back to the moment when a civilization's greatest achievement and its greatest vulnerability turned out to be the same thing, expressed in the same water, held in the same plastered basin under the same tropical sky. The cities are gone. The water that filled them is long since evaporated or absorbed back into the limestone that always wanted to swallow it. But the story of what happened in that water, of how it changed and why it changed, and what that change meant for the millions of people who depended on it, is preserved with a precision that no human scribe ever achieved, in the sediment that settled through the centuries, at the bottom of basins that the Maya built with their hands and their will, and their extraordinary, costly, ultimately insufficient ingenuity. Let that settle with you now, as the night deepens and the story finds its quiet. The waterkeeper stood up from the reservoir's edge. He walked back through the dark city. He would report what he had seen in the morning. The world he lived in was still for the moment intact. The temples standing, the plazas broad and pale in moonlight. The sleeping city arranged around its water in the geometry that centuries of human effort had made possible in a place that had no business supporting it. It was extraordinary what they had built. It was genuinely, fully, completely extraordinary. And it was ending in the way that extraordinary things sometimes end, not with a single catastrophic blow, but with the slow, quiet accumulation of everything that made it extraordinary, gradually becoming everything that made it impossible to sustain. Sleep now. The Maya lowlands are a long way away, and a long time ago, and the night is deep and still, and the story has been told, and the people who lived it have long since found their way to wherever people go when the cities they built can no longer hold them. They found water. They built again. They continued, as people do.